Welcome back to The Backstory. I'm former CIA officer John Kiriakou. In our last half hour, we are happy to welcome journalist and political analyst Caleb Maupin. Caleb is one of the best informed people out there, and we have a lot to talk about. Caleb, welcome back to the show.
Sure. Glad to be here, as always.
Well, we're glad to have you. There's so much that I want to ask you, but the first thing I want to ask is something that's kind of funny. So I Googled you the other day, just was curious to see what you were working on, and I was amused to see you identified as a radical. Are you a radical? What does that mean?
Well, I think the roots of the term radical, it simply means that you want to get to the root of the problem, right? So I guess in that sense that I see the roots of the problem in the world today as being our global capitalist system, the rule of the world by a few big multinational corporations who continue to try and keep the world poor and make the world poorer in order to secure their profits and make themselves wealthier. I guess if I see that overall systemic problem as behind many of the individual situations that we discuss in radio interviews, I guess in that sense I'm radical. But it's interesting that I'm identified that way. I've been called many things in my life. I guess radical is certainly one of them. And of all the labels I've been given, it's not one I'm anxious to disown.
There you go. There you go. I like that. Well, let's start off with international affairs. I want to ask you about something coming out of sanctions. I was watching one of the Sunday morning talk shows this past weekend, and the guest was talking about sanctions as a soft power weapon, that rather than using hard power and going to war over every little issue, that sanctions were very valuable as a tool in foreign policy. I disagree strongly with that position. I think sanctions do nothing but hurt average citizens. That sanctions invariably hit food supplies, medicine, clean water, everything that people need to just survive on a day-to-day basis. But this guy was saying that sanctions against Iran, against Russia, against China were working, and that what we've seen is these three countries essentially pull together in order to counter sanctions. Give me your thoughts, if you don't mind, on sanctions and on the role of sanctions in U.S. foreign policy. And then I want to ask you specifically about some of these countries.
Well, sanctions should be called what they really are, which is economic warfare. It is an attempt to attack a country by using economic means rather than using bombs and tanks and drones and direct military strikes. And often people think of sanctions as being, we cut into the profit margins of some of the elite businessmen in the country or of those who, do business in the state sector, et cetera. But they do hit ordinary people in pretty horrendous ways. When I was in Iran, I was served tea as I was waiting to give a TV interview by an airline pilot. And this airline pilot had completed, he had gotten his, airline pilot's license. But because of the sanctions on Iran is unable to get airplane parts, and their air travel in Iran is very restricted. And so even though his dream was to become an airline pilot, even though he had his license and was ready to become an airline pilot, he was stuck serving tea to guys like me waiting to do TV interviews because of the sanctions. However, when I went to Ecuador for the World Festival of Youth and Students back in 2013, I met a disabled young man, who is confined to a wheelchair because of a genetic condition he has. And if it were not for the sanctions on Cuba that prevents Cuba from getting the medical supplies it needs, if those medical supplies were available, he would be cured of this ailment, and he would not be able to. He would not be forced to be in a wheelchair, and that was definitely heartbreaking to me. I mean, sanctions kill people. The most blatant example is the sanctions on Iraq during the 1990s. During the 1990s, the United Nations and the World Health Organization said that the sanctions, many people resigned. There were a number of World Health Organization officials who resigned. The sanctions on Iraq resulted in an estimate of 1.2 million deaths, half of them children under 12. The word genocide was used by officials who resigned. What the United States did by preventing Iraq from getting chlorine to treat their water and preventing Iraq from importing medicine, it resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe that claimed lots of lives. So sanctions are not a laughing matter. people call them soft power, but it directly affects people's lives. People talk about the economic impact of the lockdown here in the United States. Well, now, think about how the lockdown has affected people. Think about the results of the lockdown. You can understand how economic warfare and economic moves can directly impact people's lives. And that's what economic sanctions are.
Yeah, and they're meant to destroy societies. You raise Cuba. I think that's a prime example. We've had sanctions on Cuba for almost 60 years now, or maybe it is 60 years now. Look at Iran. We've had sanctions on Iran since 1979. The Iranians could be utterly self-sufficient if it weren't for sanctions. They can certainly grow their own food. They have vast oil reserves, but we don't allow them to do anything. So tell us a little bit about this reporting that Iran, Russia, and China are working together now after sanctions. We've got sanctions on all three of these countries, which seems counterproductive and silly to me. But what are they doing to work together?
Well, it's quite interesting. The countries, all three of them, they kind of are an odd match made in heaven. You would think they are completely different, right? So China, that's the Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has been in power since 1949. They drastically reshifted their foreign policy starting in the 70s and started aligning with the United States. And their domestic economic policies drastically shifted in the late 70s with the reform and opening up. But their ideology is very much Marxism-Leninism. They are a communist government. They have essentially planned economy, 5-year economic plans, state-owned industries, and they're a manufacturing country largely. They make half the world's steel. They have the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. They make the majority of the world's copper, the majority of the world's solar panels. Russia, on the other hand, at one point, yes, you had the Soviet Union. In the 90s, you had the fall of the Soviet Union, which was an economic catastrophe. But, starting in 1999, you had the rise of Vladimir Putin and a kind of restructuring of Russia's economy to once again be centered around the state. At this point, Russia is an energy-producing country. Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-controlled energy corporations, basically hold up the Russian economy. The economy is centered around state control over natural resources and the export of energy. And it's an energy exporting country. They have a lot of manufacturing there, a lot of steel. They have titanium manufacturing, et cetera. But it's largely an economy centered around energy. Iran, on the other hand, is also an oil-based economy. And again, definitely not a Marxist country by any means. It's a country where in 1979 you had a religious revolution, and the Ayatollahs took power. They overthrew the old monarchy that was backed by the United States. The slogan was not capitalism, but Islam, neither East nor West, a war of poverty against wealth. And you have a state apparatus that is, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the biggest economic entity in the country. And they control the natural resources, namely petroleum. There's a number of other state industries, state car manufacturing, state steel manufacturing. You have a very big state that kind of provides for the population and has kind of a hostile relationship with business. And in a way, all of these countries, while they have different ideologies and different perspectives, Russia is now very much, nationalistic and Christian, Orthodox Christian in their outlook. China still espouses Marxism. Iran espouses an Islamic, theology, Shia Islam. All of them kind of have the same overall setup where you have the state kind of controlling the economy. You have a market sector, but basically a state-run economy. And raising people out of poverty, using state-controlled economic entities to stimulate other sections of the economy. And they would all like to get along with the West. They would all love to get along with the United States. They don't have, in Iran in the early years, yes, they were saying death to America and such. But at this point, Iran is not seeking, a hostile relationship with the United States. Neither is China. Neither is Russia. But because of that, because these countries are not Wall Street's playground, they've been targeted. So as they're being targeted, they're starting to do business with each other, and they're becoming more dependent on each other because the sanctions from the United States cut them off and cut off their ability to do business with other forces. And, China, as its state-controlled apparatus of industrial production expands, they need lots of oil and they need lots of natural gas. Well, just so happens Russia, as their economy grows and their state-controlled energy resources expand, they need to sell lots of oil and lots of natural gas, right? What are their bases of the economy? So Russia and China kind of go together very, very well. Iran also needs to sell oil, right? Oil is the basis of its economy. China needs to buy oil. Iran needs more cell phones, right? Well, China at this point has the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. The countries they kind of all go together. It makes you think about Zbigniew Brzezinski and his book, The Grand Chessboard, where he talked about the struggle to control Eurasia and the Eurasian hemisphere being kind of the battle to control the world. I think the Nazis made a similar argument. They called it the heartland. And when Hitler invaded Russia, it was about trying to seize control of Eurasia. The Eurasia, the Eurasian world island, or whatever you want to call it, that is kind of a basis for dominating the world. And Russia and China and Iran have kicked the United States and the U.S., monopolies and big corporations out of a big section of the Eurasian hemisphere. And it has asserted its independence. And it's a geopolitical game changer. And it's something that the big bankers and monopolists that dominate our economy would like to see reversed. They would like to be in control of Eurasia.
We've got about 2 minutes before we have to take a break, but I want to ask you, and there may not even be enough time to answer this question, but can you see a situation where the United States becomes so dependent on sanctions as a foreign policy tool that we're left behind, that these other countries like Russia, China, Iran, and others go around us and do business with each other in spite of our sanctions, where they just ignore them, and then we're left in the dust?
Absolutely. I mean, there are huge breakthroughs going on in China in terms of computers. Vladimir Putin has called for an international combined effort around the issue of fusion energy. I can definitely see the United States getting locked out. I mean, look, China is already trying to basically build up its response to Hollywood, and make their own movies, so there's a lot of developments that we are definitely getting locked out of by trying to lock the other countries out of.
Okay, let's take a break. We'll take a short one. We'll come right back, and let's talk about Afghanistan when we come back. You're listening to The Backstory. Stay tuned. We have a lot more coming up. Welcome back to The Backstory. I'm John Kiriakou. We're having a nice conversation with Caleb Maupin. He is a political consultant and journalist specializing in foreign policy, foreign affairs. And I want to ask you, Caleb, about the situation in Afghanistan. It seems that something embarrassing was leaked over the last couple of days. And this was a letter written by the U.S. government, which means the State Department in this case, urging the Taliban and the Afghan government to cooperate. What's this all about, and why is it embarrassing?
Well, I mean, as the letter stated, the USA is kind of pushing the Afghan government to enter a power-sharing agreement with the Taliban. You'll remember 20 years ago, well over 20 years ago, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, it did it for the purpose of deposing the Taliban. But now it appears that Antony Blinken is pushing the Afghan government to sign a deal where the Taliban would get 50% control over key executive bodies. The Taliban's military would be absorbed into the Afghan security forces. And that's got to be embarrassing to the United States to have invaded and occupied Afghanistan for over 20 years for the purpose of fighting the Taliban, to just then, take an agreement of handing the country back to the Taliban. I think that's what the issue there is.
Yeah, I think this is embarrassing, actually. I mean, I was all for the peace process. I think most Americans were all for the peace process that was taking place in Doha during the Trump administration. But it just seems to me that the Biden administration is giving up. At least that's what I read in this letter. Power sharing is great, but there have to be guarantees. Guarantees like rights for women, guarantees like right for education for girls, guarantees like voting rights for citizens. What we don't want to see is another coup by the Taliban, or a taking of power by force by the Taliban, like we saw in the 1990s, whereby you either get with the program or you're beheaded. That's not what we've been fighting for the last 20 years.
Well, I have long maintained that I feel like the United States doesn't really want a stable Afghanistan, for the very reasons that we discussed in our previous segment before the commercial break. namely top three geopolitical rivals of the United States: Iran, Russia, and China. Look at a map. Where is Afghanistan? It is right there in the middle of all three of them, right? You've got Russia to the north, you've got China to the west, and you've got, or to the east, and you've then got Iran on, to the south of them. And that all three of those countries have suffered from a big problem of terrorist groups operating based in Afghanistan, going over their borders and spreading chaos, of drug gangs and heroin dealers, operating in Afghanistan, going over their borders, and that keeping Afghanistan as kind of a strategic epicenter of chaos with, Iran, Russia, and China having to deal with all the problems, flowing over their borders from an unstable Afghanistan has been a way to covertly kind of, harass these three Eurasian rivals of American power. And to have Afghanistan, right there in Central Asia, as now Afghanistan is the center of the global heroin trade. At least 50% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan, right? I mean, it's poppy fields everywhere. All kinds of terrorist groups are operating there. All kinds of weapons are flowing out of Afghanistan from terrorist groups into the hands of terrorist groups throughout the region. Afghanistan and its instability and its poverty, really, I mean, it's a very, very impoverished country, has caused lots of problems for the countries that border it. And three of those countries happen to be major rivals of the United States. Now, this power sharing agreement, if it is implemented, it may result in further instability in Afghanistan, and that would be, in the long-term interest of trying to destabilize Iran, Russia, and China. So it's not particularly shocking to me. What I do think is interesting is that the Taliban, you talk about their history, they're emerging kind of as a faction among the folks who fought against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Then in the 90s, you have a coup, and they take power, and then they're eradicating drugs, and there's the whole issue where they wouldn't go along with a pipeline that the United States wanted. And, the Taliban, their geopolitical loyalties seem to drift in the wind. They will do business with whoever they think will give them the best deal at the end of the day. And I think that is something the United States is very aware of, that the Taliban is in business for itself. It is a religious entity, fanatical, but it's not particularly loyal to the United States. It's not particularly loyal to Russia or China or the U.S. as geopolitical rivals. The Taliban works for the Taliban, and they'll make a deal with anybody based on what they think is in their short-term interest.
I think that's right. And, I think that the Afghan government is kowtowing to the Taliban right now because they see the writing on the wall. Just this morning, for example, the Afghan Ministry of Education announced a new ban on girls over the age of 12 singing in public. So if you are a girl over the age of 12, you are no longer allowed to sing in public. And if you're caught singing, you will be jailed. We should expect to see things like that. But with that said, I agree with you that the Taliban is loyal to nobody. And if you look historically, they never have been. The Taliban leadership was shocked, for example, in 2001 when we began attacking them, because they made clear that Osama bin Laden aside, they had no beef with the United States, right? That they were compelled by their culture to provide shelter for al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda had asked for it. And their culture compelled them to provide aid to an outsider, a foreigner who requested that aid. It's just the way it's been for thousands of years. And so they argued that they had no problem with the United States. They had not raised arms against the United States, and they couldn't understand why we wanted to overthrow them and fight them. That if we wanted to fight al-Qaeda on their soil, that was perfectly fine and good. But there was no reason for us to overthrow them. And then overthrow them we did. I agree with you, though, and it's not just the Taliban in that region. When I was serving in Pakistan, there were billboards all over the place in Lahore, in Islamabad, in Peshawar that were lauding this new bridge called the Peace and Friendship Bridge that connected northernmost Pakistan with western China. There's this little teeny tiny strip of land that constitutes the Chinese-Pakistan border. It's barely noticeable on a map. And they built a bridge connecting the two countries over a river. And I said to this general, who is my regular point of contact, you guys sure are making a big deal about this peace and friendship bridge. And very pointedly, he said to me, yes, he said, the Chinese are the only friends we have in the world who have never turned on us. And then he looked at me, because God knows we've turned on the Pakistanis over the years. So it's not just Afghanistan, it's Pakistan, it's India to a certain respect, it's Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. You know, they'll work with us now, but they don't necessarily trust us, and they certainly don't think we'll be there for them over the long term.
Indeed. Look, the best time in Afghan history for women was the period when Afghanistan, starting from 1978 up until, I think, 1993.
Absolutely.
You had the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And the People's Democratic Party took power, and they started teaching women to read. They, had literacy campaigns in the countryside. They started reforesting the country because the British Empire had cut down a lot of their trees, and they started, reforesting parts of the country that had just been, devastated by the British, taking all their lumber. And, they had a lot of, efforts to try and industrialize the country. Now, unfortunately, the People's Democratic Party was a Marxist-Leninist, communist, Soviet-aligned party. And there was a faction in the People's Democratic Party that was, I think you would call them ultra-left or ultra-radical. And they were very hostile to the peasantry. The peasantry of Afghanistan, the rural folks, anyone who's been there will tell you how deeply, deeply conservative those folks are. I mean, Islam, religion is the center of their lives. And obviously, the Marxist-Leninist Party was an atheist party. It had an anti-religious viewpoint. It viewed religion as primitive and superstitious. And while one faction of the People's Democratic Party was trying to be more sensitive to Islam, the more radical faction, continued to be very hostile to the religious folks in the countryside. And that created an opening, for Osama bin Laden and, the United States aligning with, Wahhabi forces, Muslims around the world, going to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. And that's kind of the situation there. I would say that, that bridge that you talked about is very important because at the end of the day, the only way you're really going to get stability in Afghanistan is with economic development. As long as people are impoverished and starving and desperate, you're going to have drug gangs and you're going to have terrorist groups.
Yes,
when people have real economic opportunity, if you could bring railway through Afghanistan, if you could have some factories in Afghanistan that could export products that could then, get to the ocean through railway transportation or some highways. If you look at some of the plans that have been drawn up, with Iran or China with the Belt and Road Initiative, economic development would bring a stable Afghanistan. That's really the only way you can do it. I mean, it's an economic problem fundamentally. This is a part of the world that has been left behind from industrialization. I mean, there's mass illiteracy in Afghanistan. So, lots of people without running water, without electricity.
I couldn't agree more. We've got about 3.5 minutes left, and I want to turn to Haiti. Haiti is in the throes of what may be a revolution right now, and it's getting almost zero coverage in the American press. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in Haiti and why it's so important.
Well, Haiti is economically just a basket case. I mean, the country has just been devastated. I mean, it's a deeply poor country. And the current president of the country is taking some unconstitutional measures to try and stay in office. And the population isn't thrilled about that. And partially they're not thrilled about it because they feel he's doing this to continue his economic austerity, right? I mean, the living standards in Haiti are already very low. I mean, people eat dirt mixed with oil. I mean, the malnutrition, lack of access to healthcare. It's a deeply impoverished country. All kinds of free trade and neoliberalism and Western capitalism has left the country just underdeveloped. And now we have, the president taking an autocratic move and trying to stay in power to continue very unpopular economic policies. Aristide was the leader at one point and was kind of a precursor of Hugo Chavez and Bolivarian socialism. He was removed by the United States. There was a U.S. military intervention to remove him. The country has had, pro-U.S. kind of leaders for a long time. The economy has gotten worse. So now the population is in rebellion against this president, who's viewed as kind of an austerity dictator. And that's the situation. And U.S. media is, of course, blocking it out, doesn't want you to know what's happening. I interviewed reporter Danny Shaw. He was there. He wasn't even able to live stream on Facebook. Facebook continued blocking his streams of the protests that are happening there.
Oh, my God.
It's worth paying attention to the situation there because it's, again, a population that was already economically suffering. Now, the pandemic has just wrecked the place. The people are ready to fight. They're in the streets. And Wall Street is very afraid that, we could see the rise in Haiti of a new kind of socialist government like we have in Nicaragua or in Cuba or in Venezuela.
We have only a minute and a half left, but when I was with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff, I did a study on the Haitian economy. And one of the things that I was surprised to learn was that the 7 largest merchant families, the merchant families that run the entire Haitian economy, are white. I was fascinated by that.
Yeah, I mean, it is particularly shocking, but the country that was the first slave revolution that became a country essentially because the slaves broke their chains, was the first black government basically on the Western Hemisphere. The fact that the wealth is dominated by people of white skin really shows you how blatant the neocolonialism is. I mean, the fact that they were paying reparations to France for hundreds of years. For hundreds of years, they were paying reparations to France for having dared, win their freedom and rise up against slavery. The way Haiti has just been punished for their anti-colonial past is pretty horrendous.
It's pretty horrendous. And it's like we never learn our lessons, especially in our own hemisphere. There are so many ways we could have helped the Haitian people. And instead, we decided to take advantage of them. It's not an accident that Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And it's no wonder that so many Haitians are trying to get out of their country to try to save themselves. But we will leave it there. We were happy to be joined today by Michelle Witte, the co-host of Political Misfits, and by journalist and political analyst Caleb Maupin. Thanks to both of them for coming on to the show today. And thank you for listening. Join us again tomorrow. This is The Backstory.